You're watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
When I first started doing this presentation in the mid-1990s, wow, it's a long time. Before I had my PowerPoint, I used to brainstorm with my audience, let's come up with a list of values that we'd like to see in as perfect a world as humanly possible. And after asking about 1,500 people, Jews from all backgrounds, religious, secular, everything in between, lots of non-Jews thrown in, I stopped doing it because I noticed that everyone is giving me the exact same list. So when it came time to create the PowerPoint you're going to see now, I just took the feedback from all my audiences and condensed it down to the 6 basic values it seems that we'd all like to see in as perfect a world as humanly possible. And they are, let's see, there it is, value of life. This is not one of my kids. It's cute, but not one of mine. But the right to be alive is the most basic of all values, obviously. Number 2 is world peace, a world where there's no more wars, where everyone gets along harmoniously. Number 3 is equal justice, a world where everyone is treated equally before the law, regardless of their position in society. 4 is education, a world where everyone is functionally literate as a way of achieving their potential and contributing in a meaningful way to the world. 5 is not a value, but an institution that's essential for all values, which is family. Because family is what teaches values. If family falls apart, society falls apart. Family is what builds the building blocks of society. And number 6 is a huge category. There it is, my sound. Social responsibility, which is people taking care of the world, whether we're talking about crime, poverty, environmental issues, animal rights. So here we have our 6 basic values. Looks good? We like these? We should have these in the world? You should look around the room. This might be the only time you ever see a room full of Jews agreeing on anything. And it's not just Jews. Anyone who sees this list has immediate recognition. This is the way the world should be. We don't have to think, do I want peace? Is value of life good? Should people be treated equally before the law? Should they take responsibility for the world? It's almost as if these ideas are born, like programmed into our brains, like software that we come with when we come into this world. So the first part of the presentation is, let's go back to the ancient world, and let's see, in fact, are these values innate in human history? Are people born with them? Or did we learn them from somewhere? And if we learned them from somewhere, what's the source? Well, we appreciate that. Ancient Greece, for instance, gave us much of our ideas of beauty, art, architecture, philosophy. Certainly one of the most creative societies of all of human history were the Greeks. And the Romans, besides spreading Greek ideas around, gave us much of our conception of government, law, engineering, armies, the world's most successfully run empire. Now, obviously, many other civilizations contributed. And even if we don't look at all of them, we don't have to. Because one of the things I discovered when I was researching my book was although culture varies tremendously from place to place, like what the Greeks and Romans may have eaten or how they dressed may have been very different from how the Chinese or Indians or Japanese ate or dressed. But what all those civilizations thought about things like value of life and social responsibility and education, remarkably similar. So with that introduction in mind, let's now go back to the ancient world, beginning with value of life, and let's see where do we get the values from. A couple of examples to illustrate how different is the value of life in the ancient world. Anyone know the most common form of population control practiced by virtually every single civilization we know of in antiquity? Infanticide. Correct. Killing of newborn babies. Killing of newborn babies, universal practice in the ancient world, not just as a means of population control, but also as a means of sex selection. Sorry, ladies, but in almost all ancient cultures, boys were valued and girls were considered disposable. And it wasn't done by the baby disposal squad. In a place like ancient Greece thousands of years ago, unwanted newborn child would be taken by the parent, stuffed into a clay jar, and then thrown out in the garbage. Or left out on a rock in the woods to be eaten by a wild animal or die of exposure. Or dropped down a well to drown. And this wasn't something that the better educated upper classes thought was like primitive or cruel. You can find some of the greatest minds in the ancient world extolling the virtue of killing babies. Here's Aristotle in his Politics. He said, there must be a law that no imperfect or maimed child shall be brought up, and to avoid an excess of population, some children must be exposed, for a limit must be fixed to the population of the state. very cold, rational thinking. Now, one of the few things that does still shock us today is hearing about the killing or injuring of a child or a baby. Not so in the ancient world. In the ancient world, you could talk about dumping your baby down the sewer the way you talk about the weather. That's how normal and acceptable it was. Another shocking example of the different attitude towards value of life is killing people for religious reasons. Human sacrifice, which again is pretty much practiced everywhere in the ancient world, although to very varying degrees. Some cultures, like the Greeks and Romans, didn't kill lots of people for religious reasons, while other cultures did it constantly. Some cultures sacrificed prisoners and slaves. You know, when the emperor of China died thousands of years ago, they would behead hundreds of prisoners at his funeral. You guys heard of Genghis Khan, the great Mongol conqueror of Asia in the 13th century? When he died, he was buried with 40 virgins and 40 horses. I don't know which he had more fun with, but it shows you the kind of guy he was. But the worst example I could think of the different attitude towards value of life is killing people for entertainment. You know, today we have blood sport like boxing. But there's limits to the violence. You're not supposed to kill people in a boxing match. Remember years ago, Mike Tyson bit off a piece of Evander Holyfield's ear in a boxing match, and they banned him from the sport for excessive violence. Not so in the ancient world. In the ancient world, many civilizations went all the way and killed people. In over 200 locations throughout the Roman Empire, the Romans built these massive circular arenas. The second largest ever built, and certainly the most famous and the most beautiful, is this one. We know it as the Colosseum. Its correct name is the Flavian Amphitheater. The main sporting event of the Colosseum, which along with chariot races was the main sporting event of the empire, these guys, gladiators. Prisoners or slaves who fought to the death in front of all these screaming fans. Which means if you sat through these tournaments, it would take weeks. You saw thousands of human beings die live before your eyes. And they didn't just use men. They used women, children, blind people, dwarves, anything for the sake of entertainment. The most sophisticated civilization in the ancient world was the most brutal. Which, by the way, doesn't mean in Rome you could just murder people on the streets. The Romans were super into law and order. But that's different from saying life had value. And one of the things we see when we look at the ancient world is the most basic of all of our values, value of life, is basically absent from the ancient world. World peace. Now today, everyone wants peace. You know, people who were against the Vietnam War years ago or against the war in Iraq, they protest, they wear buttons that say things like war is not healthy for children and other living things. It's an obvious point that war isn't healthy for anyone. It's an obvious point that war is the greatest waste of human life and human resources, the most destructive pastime human beings participate in. How much money do you think the world spends on defense budgets and weapons every year? What do you think? What do you think? $1.4 trillion, of which the United States spends $600 billion of that. Isn't that unbelievable? The U.S. spends more on its defense budget than the next 15 countries in the world combined. But think of what you could do with $1.4 trillion if you didn't have to arm armies and make wars. Think how much food and education and housing and clean water. You guys know tens of thousands of children die every day, primarily in Africa, from not having clean water. And diseases that come from not having clean water. Guys, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that war is destructive. We know it now. They knew it then. But if we know it and it's so obvious, how come 6,000 years of human history is 6,000 years of warfare? If you ask the experts and the historians, they say the number one reason for war is greed. Taking what's not yours by force. Land primarily, but also women, gold, silver, cattle, you name it. The other main reason for war is, what's the law of the jungle? What's the law of the jungle? Yeah, survival of the fittest. The strong survive, the weaker lunch. The lion's on top of the food chain because he eats everyone and no one eats him. He doesn't say to the gazelle in Africa, you know, you had a rough day. You sit by the water hole. I'll go chase a zebra. He says, if I catch you, you're lunch. That's how animals behave. That's how empires behaved. You think Rome ever respected any country's borders? If the Romans didn't conquer someone like the Persian Empire, it's only because they couldn't. Conquest was natural, and not to conquer was a sign of weakness. And of course, the third reason why there's so much war in human history, who's glorified in ancient history? Where's the world's first heroic literature in the West? It's on the screen. Remember the Iliad? Okay, the Trojan horse story recently made to a really bad movie with Brad Pitt, you know. Troy. The book's much better. But go read the book again. It is one giant battle scene with occasional breaks for long speeches. Because the hero, by definition, is the warrior. The guy who kills the most and the greatest opponents. He gets the honor, the glory, and the power when he's alive, and he becomes a legend after he's dead. To be a warrior is the thing for guys to do everywhere in human history. I say guys specifically because if women ran the world, it would be a totally different world. You know, a woman comedian once said, when a woman gets depressed, she eats or she shops. When a man gets depressed, he has to invade another country. Because these guys live for war and conquest. And when you look in the ancient world, you see that peace was basically the break that civilizations, nations, and empires took between wars so they could rearm and go fight again. Otherwise, it's basically absent. So another value gone. I had fun with PowerPoint on this. Okay, equal justice. Now, we take this very much for granted because we all come from a country that is a liberal democratic society. And by the way, the true power of democracy has less to do with whether you vote and much more to do with whether there's a system of laws that everyone is subject to and no one is above. The U.S. Constitution being an excellent example. We just assume that's normal and natural. That's what we're used to. But if we beam ourselves back to the ancient world, look at the guy on the right. Let's call him Joe Average Ancient Guy. Where is the average ancient guy on the socioeconomic ladder? Is he upper class, middle class, or lower class? Lower class. What do we call him? A serf, a peasant. Now, we associate, because we're Westerners, that title with feudal Europe of 1,000 years ago, but feudal systems exist everywhere in the world at all time, including today. But go back to Europe 1,000 years ago. 90% of the population were peasants or serfs. What do they do for a living? Same thing he's doing, which is what? He's a farmer. Okay, does he own the land he farms? No, backbreaking labor dawn to dusk, usually for someone else. And even if he owned a little piece of land like he's sharecropping, who does he pay most of what he harvests in taxes to? Joe Lord. And you know, with an outfit like this man has no plans to do any manual labor. Last time I was in South Beach in Florida, I saw a guy dressed just like that, without the sword, but he had a cell phone instead. Anyway, what gives Joe Lord the right to lord over all the peasants? Did they elect him? No. The golden rule. What's the golden rule? Right. He who has the gold makes the rules. Birth and wealth are pretty much the sole criteria for leadership in human history. What you and your family owned decided who led. And between that elite, that teeny minority, the wealthy, the nobility, and everyone else, is there equality before the law? Absolutely not. There's institutionalized inequality with those guys above everyone else, and everyone else is at their mercy. And of course, the ultimate elite in human history are these people, monarchs. A guy like Pharaoh 4,500 years ago, when you read about him in the Bible, you have no idea how powerful this guy was. He was a living God. And they took this very seriously. By the time you get to who's that in the middle? Henry VIII. The great Renaissance kings of Europe, let's say 500 years ago, they're no longer living gods. They've come down a couple notches. But they rule by divine right. What's divine right of kings? God made me king, and if you don't like it, like the Queen of Hearts said, off with his head. By the way, he had 2 of his own wives beheaded. So tremendous inequality in human history. But to be fair, where's the world's first democracy? Where does it come from? The first democracy in human history comes from Greece. The word is actually a Greek word, demos kratos. The people govern. And the Athenians had the most efficient democratic system in human history, which is citizens vote directly. Do you guys vote directly on stuff? No. You vote for a congressman or a congresswoman who hopefully shows up and maybe votes the way you elected him or her to vote, which is by no means guaranteed. In Israel, it's much worse, trust me. The only time they show up is as a budget vote. Which is probably why Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for every other one we've tried from time to time throughout history. It ain't perfect, but it's better than anything else. And the Greeks seem to have the best version of it. But who were citizens who voted in Greek democracy? Men, not just men, more than that, men with land. Sounds like a rock group. They're coming out with a CD next week. A couple thousand adult men with man ruled Greece. Okay? It was an oligarchy, a power elite. Everyone else was disenfranchised, cut out of the process. Women, artisans, freedmen, slaves, aliens. If you could beam yourself back to the oligarchy that ruled Greece in Athens 2,500 years ago and tell them, you know what equal justice is going to be in the future? It's that everyone, man, woman, rich, poor, they're all going to be treated equally before the same laws. They would have said, are you out of your mind? We assume that in any liberal democratic country, government not only has an obligation to educate its citizens to a certain minimum level, but the government actually wants to do that. Why would government want educated citizens? What do you gain by educating your population? Yeah, you get a much more productive, technologically developed first world country. One of the big factors that separates the first and the third world today is level of education of the population, literacy rates. So we would think logically, since the Greeks and Romans, especially the Romans, they were so organized. They ran such an amazing empire for hundreds of years. They must have had a pretty good public education system. That's what we might think. But let's go back to Joe Average Ancient Guy. Here he is with his torn stockings even, sowing his seeds in the field. What percentage of people in the ancient world do you think historians estimate were functionally literate? I'm not talking about graduating high school, that they could just read like a street sign. On average, 1 in 1,000 people could read. Come on, today in New York, I think 3/4 of the people can read the street signs. If they're in Spanish, it's at least 95% of them. Why are the rates of literacy so ridiculously low in the ancient world? Why do you think? So, it says in the Ethics of the Fathers, great Jewish wisdom, it says, who is wealthy? He who is happy with what he has. So if you wake up in the morning and think about this for just a minute every day, you will be very wealthy, even if you're not so wealthy. If you live in a first world country, and America is the first of the first world, you live in a house, not a shack, a shed, a hut, a house, indoor plumbing, running water, electricity, a kitchen that's full of food that you don't eat all the food because you're worried about being fat. You guys have any idea what a luxury it is in human history to worry about weighing too much? And you got a 9-to-5 job with weekends, vacation, health plan, retirement. You got your teeth in your mouth past the age of 30 and you live to see your grandchildren. You have a standard of living that only exceeds almost everyone who lived in the ancient world. You have a standard of living that exceeds most people in the world today. What was the daily goal of the average ancient peasant thousands of years ago? Survive. Before modern science, technology, medicine, you had horrendous rates of disease, plagues, wars, famine. Even giving birth was a dangerous thing for women to do. Up until right into the late 18th, early 19th century, half the kids, and even in the industrialized world, like in Europe, died by the age of 2. And if the name of the game is survive, what do your kids have to do as soon as they're old enough to start doing it? They got to work, which is why child labor is ubiquitous. It's universal in the ancient world and in the third world today. What do you mean send my kid to school? He goes to school. We starve. But let's say you're a little better off and can afford to, send your kid to school and even pay tuition. You'd think you'd find a school system even for pay in the ancient world? Very rare. The Greeks, who loved wisdom, considered it literally prostitution for a teacher to sell wisdom. A Greek scholar would take a select group of young boys and impart to them his wisdom and something else we'll talk about in just a minute, but you never sold it. And the other reason that you got correctly, you said 100% correctly, was, think about it, who starts all the trouble? Like in America in the 60s, in Europe, and it's always students. To be young and idealistic on one hand, and educated and empowered on the other, makes a very dangerous combination to control. In the non-democratic ancient world, they figured out pretty quickly the best way to keep things stable was to keep people stupid. So whether because of just having to survive or deliberate government policy, and usually it was a combination of both, virtually no one in the ancient world could read. So another value, gone. Family is something that everyone has. There's no such thing as a society in human history, any period of time, it doesn't have a family infrastructure. So I'm going to look at a subcategory of family because it had a huge impact on family. It's a topic you never learned in school. It's a topic that they're not going to teach you. It's probably the topic you'll remember the best of everything I say tonight. But it's a topic that had massive impact, not only stabilities of families, but the stability of whole civilizations and empires. And that's the impact of sexuality and modesty. And modesty. Not just on family stability, but the stability of the whole world. Now, to appreciate this point, it basically depends on how old you are. I'm not saying you have to be a certain level of maturity, but rather when you lived in America. Because anyone who's above a certain age recognizes how much the standards in America have changed so dramatically. Okay, when I was a little kid, and by the way, still today, America is not. It isn't New York and L.A. America is, Idaho and Omaha and Tennessee. It's a very traditional place. Still the most conservative, God-believing place in the world is the United States. You know that? What percentage of Americans believe in God? 92%. Yeah. Israelis are only at 87, which is remarkably high, because in Sweden it's only 15%. The most religious country in Western Europe is England, where there's only 50%. By the way, more Muslims go to mosques on Friday than Anglicans, and the Muslims are less than 10%, and the Anglicans in England go to church on Sunday. So that's a separate topic. But America is a very traditional conservative place. And if you could think your way back to the old TV shows, I'm talking like the 60s and early 70s, before it all went to pot. I remember they used to have commercials where they actually showed you the product. Today, the product often doesn't appear. Like, use a woman, she's the focus. Now, I'm not going to show you any racy ads here. But here's a great example of using a very pretty woman to sell a product that Sigmund Freud would have a field day with. Because they figured out a long time ago that sex sells. And we are so over-bombarded with this stuff, you cannot get people to blush anymore. Guys, as open as we think we are today, compared to the ancient world, we're living in like a G-rated Bambi film. I personally postulate if the Greeks and Romans had a television and advertising, because their society's values were so different, they would have collapsed a lot quicker than they did. That's how different the standards were going back to the ancient world. In the ancient world, they had no problem not only with full frontal nudity, but with the most graphic pornography on your walls and on your dinnerware. When you got to the bottom of your cornflakes bowl in ancient Greece, you didn't find Winnie the Pooh. You saw something much more interesting. And you notice there's a huge amount of nudity, and everyone looks great, by the way. You ever seen a fat Greek statue? Everyone's like ripped. Look at this guy over here, the discus thrower. Take the Olympics. Where did they begin? They began as pseudo-military sporting events thousands of years ago in Greece, where lovely young boys ran, wrestled, and threw spears and discuses all in the nude. It's a good thing they had no advertising, because there was no place for the Nike signs. No tracksuits. And it wasn't because they couldn't afford sportswear. But in a place like ancient Greece, the human form was considered the ultimate expression of beauty and perfection, and you wanted to show it all off. It's such a radical idea, even for us. Where do the Greeks practice their sports? The same place you do today, a building called a gymnasium, which comes from the Greek word gymnos, which means naked. And everyone is going to remember that when you go to the gym next time, I promise you. What's the most open country in Europe today? Sweden's the most atheist, but Holland, the Netherlands. Okay? Marijuana, you can smoke it on the street, although apparently now only in the Jewish quarter. I just heard, whatever. Prostitution is a legal profession that is unionized and has health benefits. It is, I'm not joking. But even in the Netherlands, and I've been there a bunch of times, not for those things, to teach. Okay? But even in the Netherlands, if you need a public toilet, you go into a men's room or a woman's room and into a stall. You know what a public toilet was in ancient Greece? It was a public toilet. Like, imagine you're driving down Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, and there's benches on the street with holes in them, and people are just doing their business as you're driving by. I'm telling you, the standards were so different, we would be shocked. And in the area of sexuality, the contrast is even more extreme. And again, depending upon how old you are, you'll appreciate this point much more. If you go back to like the 60s or early 70s, forget showing anything on television. The word sex was never heard out of anyone's mouth. The first TV show where a married couple was in the same bed together in pajamas reading a newspaper was The Brady Bunch. And that was considered incredibly risque for its time. And you never talked about alternative lifestyles, coming out of the closet, No, this was all taboo. Fast forward to the 21st century, and we show everything, we talk about everything. The catchphrase in the Western world is today what consenting adults want to do behind closed doors is their business. You don't discriminate against people because of their sexual preferences. Everyone thinks they're so open. Guys, compared to the ancient world, we're living in that Bambi film again. In the ancient world, by the way, there's no idea of coming out of the closet. Not because they didn't have closets for the tracksuits they didn't wear, but because there's really no concept of what's correct or incorrect in a physical relationship with another human being. Now, here I have to generalize somewhat because it varies from culture to culture. But pretty much, as a guy, if I could generalize, in the ancient world, it was considered equally normal and acceptable to have a relationship with another man, a boy, a woman, a girl, a sheep, a goat, an inanimate object. And sexuality permeated the world in ways that would make the most open society today blush. Now, if we beam ourselves across to Holland again, which is very tolerant of everything, and consenting adults can do what they like even in public, they'll still say in Holland, guys, whatever you want to do is totally cool, but please keep your hands off of little boys. Minors, that stuff. It's called pedophiles. Not so in the ancient world. In the ancient world, a sexual and educational relationship between a well-educated upper-class guy and a young boy, especially like in Greek culture, was considered an absolutely vital part of a child's education and the highest form of love. And you can see, by the way, this is talked about all over the place. Here's a great example. This is Plato's Symposium. Now, by the way, can you imagine? And let's put this in framework. That means if you were upper-class Greek parents 2,500 years ago, and like your 9-year-old son, Demetrius, was not taken into a sexual and educational relationship by your 30-year-old next-door male neighbor, it'd be the equivalent today, not to compare the two, but like Jewish parents not getting their kid into college. No one wants Demetrius Achenveya Shanda. Can you imagine, God forbid, 1,000,000 times your neighbor does that to your kid? I think the reaction would be a little bit different today than it was in ancient Greece. In the ancient world, real men chased boys. He's talking about it's macho. Real men chased boys. Wimps wasted their time on women. This is true of Japanese samurai culture. This is true of Greek warrior culture of Sparta. And this isn't abstract philosophical speculation here. The Greeks had whole army units of older men who fought in pairs with their younger boyfriends. And this wasn't a bunch of guys in pumps and tutus charging over hills with feather dusters saying, let's get them, boys, We're talking about the toughest guys in the Greek army because no one wanted to die ingloriously in front of their lover. And this is not what they teach you in 6th grade. Even in the movies today, they don't show this. They didn't show it in the movie The Last Samurai. They didn't show it in that movie Sparta, But this is the reality of the culture. The question we want to look at is what's the impact? How did this affect, like birth rates? How did it affect treatment of women? What did the Greeks think about women? Look at the Greek poet Palladius. Marriage brings a man only 2 happy days. The day he takes his bride to bed and the day he lays her in her grave. Not one of the early feminist writers. But seriously, what's the impact of all this on society? First of all, from the top down, like the royal families of Rome, that were supposed to have been the best model for society, were the worst example to follow. But what do you think happened on a more basic level, like to the birth rates of Greece and Rome? And this is why it's so important to learn history, because this stuff repeats itself. What do you think happened to Greek and Roman birth rates? Yeah, declined is way too tame a word. They collapsed. Greek men were way too busy chasing everything but their wives to bother to make babies. Rome, already during the reign of Augustus, the first real Roman Caesar, tried to pass laws trying to force men to marry and have a minimum number of children. You can't force people to have kids. It's got to be a value in society. Rome built the greatest empire in Western civilization because Roman citizens fought and died in the Roman legions. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, their birth rate had dropped so low, they literally had no one left to fight in their army. They had to outsource their security and defense needs to Germanic mercenaries. You can't defend an empire with mercenaries. Some of the greatest civilizations in the ancient world literally rotted from within before they were overrun from without, and to a very significant extent, it had to do with the collapse of family. So another value, gone. By the way, you should know, because I always say history repeats itself, or as George Santayana said, those who don't learn from the past are destined to repeat it. This is happening in the Western world. Okay? Every Western, to keep just a little side point, but very interesting, to keep your population static, not growing, not shrinking, how many kids per family does every woman have to have? 2.1. A girl asked me once what 0.1 looked like. I said a tooth, an eye, an ear, a kidney, and 3 fingers. She goes, really? I said, it's a statistic. It's not a baby. No, seriously. There's a slight infant mortality rate, so it's a little over 2. Do you know there's not one country in the Western Hemisphere except for, about Israel, yes, and America is the only other country. Not the white population of America, by the way, the Hispanic population, whatever. But every other country in Europe has birth rates and in Canada, by the way, 1.3 to 1.6 kids per family, which is demographic suicide. They live longer. Who's going to pay the worst? You retire at 60. The Greeks retire at 52. They went on strike because they wanted to work to 53. You're going to live to be 80. There's no one left to pay into Social Security benefits. It's a very scary situation. Throw into that the very high Muslim birth rates in Europe, where the women have 4 to 8 kids per family. And you're going to have a very interesting demographic change in Europe in the next 50 years. But whatever, that's a side topic. Okay, last but not least, social responsibility. And this, by the way, is pretty quick to do because simply put, in the ancient world, there basically wasn't any. Today, in any modern liberal democratic society, if you're hungry and homeless, government will help you. It's not a perfect system, but government's obligation is to help people who are down and out. And not only, but in the ancient world, by the way, you appreciate almost all the social welfare that exists in the world today came into existence in the last 200 years. Before that, there was virtually nothing. 2,000 years ago in Rome, which was probably the largest city on the planet Earth, if you were hungry and homeless and didn't have family to help, tough, die. The government would do nothing for you. And today we have this even more beautiful idea of international social responsibility. We've seen all the horrible earthquakes and tsunamis in Haiti and Chile and, of course, Japan and every country in the world sends in relief workers. Isn't it amazing that Israel got the first hospitals in Haiti? I think America's a little closer. And Japan also. They sent the first field hospitals to both those places. Let's hear it for Israel. Yeah. Anyway, but everyone sends in relief workers and aid. You have Doctors Without Borders, International Monetary Fund, United Nations peacekeeping forces. You think you had any of that in the ancient world? Can you imagine asking Rome for a peacekeeping force? That's a very scary thought. What were leaders in the non-democratic ancient world interested in? It wasn't making the world a better place. Democracy. Trust me, it wasn't. What were they interested in? It was one word that began with the letter P, and it wasn't the word peace. It's the word power. Preserving, passing on, and preferably increasing it. Remember Genghis Khan, the guy who was buried with the 40 virgins and 40 horses? Look at his view of what's meaningful in this world. The greatest happiness is to vanquish your enemies, to chase them before you, to rob them of their wealth, to see those dear to them bathed in tears, to clasp to your bosom their wives and daughters. A true humanitarian visionary. So this value, more than anything else, is basically absent. So what are we left with? A very different vision of the ancient world than we maybe got in 6th grade. And by the way, I'm not saying that everyone in the ancient world was horrible and evil. Not true. The vast, vast, vast majority of people in human history are just trying to do what? Survive. They're not hurting anyone. It's not the issue here. I'm not saying that good stuff, good ideas and technology didn't come out of the ancient world, because our modern world is built on what they discovered and created. That's not the issue either. But one thing is very clear. This beautiful vision of values that the whole world today wants and seems to be so innate in our consciousness is not in fact innate, and is not a product of the great civilizations like Greece and Rome, China. So we're left with this huge question. Where do we get the values from? Now, there's a British historian by the name of Paul Johnson. His expertise, he's not Jewish, his expertise is Christian and European history. In 1987, he wrote a book called The History of the Jews, which I've been recommending for decades as a really good introduction to Jewish history. But now I wrote my own. It's right there on the table, and it's, of course, much better. Ask my mother. She will definitely agree. But in the epilogue of that book, Paul Johnson does a beautiful job of answering this huge question. I'd like to share it with you. He says, one way of summing up 4,000 years of Jewish history is to ask ourselves, what would have happened to the human race if Abraham had not been a man of great sagacity? That's a great SAT word. It means sage like, wise, or clever. Or if he had stayed in Ur and kept his higher notions to himself, and no specific Jewish people would have come into being. Certainly the world without the Jew would have been a radically different place. Humanity might eventually have stumbled upon all the Jewish insights, but we cannot be sure. All the great conceptual discoveries of the human intellect seem obvious and inescapable once they have been revealed, but it requires a special genius to formulate them for the first time. The Jews had this gift. Now pay special attention to what he says now, keeping in mind the list I got from my audience when I was creating this presentation. To them we owe the idea of equality before the law, both divine and human, of the sanctity of life and the dignity of human person, of individual conscience and so of personal redemption, of collective conscience and so of social responsibility, of peace as an abstract ideal and love as the foundation of justice, and many other items which constitute the basic moral furniture of the human mind. Without the Jews, it might have been a much emptier place. Above all, the Jews taught us how to rationalize the unknown. The result was monotheism and the three great religions which profess it. It is almost beyond our capacity to imagine how the world would have fared had they never emerged. That's a nice quote. It's a good thing a non-Jew said it, by the way, because if a Jew said it, no one will believe it. I learned that a long time ago. When you want to say things about Jews, get non-Jews to say it. More credibility. What Paul Johnson is saying is not unique to Paul Johnson. In the course of researching my book and writing this seminar, I came across dozens of presidents, prime ministers, philosophers, historians, thinkers. They all say the same thing. We, the Jewish people, civilized the world. Fact. Now, I'm not saying, by the way, that we're perfect and everyone else is terrible. Not true. There are righteous Gentiles. Lots of them. There are lousy Jews, like Bernie Madoff, most appropriately named criminal in the world. He made off with $60 billion of everyone's money. No, seriously. Nor am I saying we invented all the nice ideas in the world. We didn't invent all these words. But there's no question that we, the teeny tiny Jewish people, who really even shouldn't be here, have had a far bigger impact on the collective consciousness of humanity, far greater than the greatest civilizations, nations, and empires. As to why that is so, we'll look at in just a couple of minutes. What I want to do now, much more briefly than I did the first part, is I just want to run you back through this list and show you how Judaism in every one of these areas is truly revolutionary. So to begin at the beginning with value of life. The clearest distinction between the Jewish concept of value of life and everyone else in the ancient world is best seen by looking at number 6 of the Ten Commandments. Quick Ten Commandments quiz. What's number 6? Don't murder. By the way, it's always mistranslated as thou shalt not kill. The most mistranslated word in the Hebrew Bible. There's a difference between murder and killing. It's lo tirtzach, don't murder, not lo taharog, don't kill. Judaism taught the world that human life has intrinsic value. We taught the world you don't kill babies. God doesn't need human blood. God forbid you kill a human being for entertainment. But why is it, by the way, lo tirtzach, don't murder, and not lo taharog, don't kill? Anyone know? Sorry? Yeah, because we value life above everything else, but sometimes you got to destroy evil to preserve good, which is why in Jewish law there's a death penalty and why sometimes you have to go to war. But because preservation of life is so important, it's extremely difficult in Jewish law to sentence another human being to death. And you have to violate almost all the commandments of the Torah to save someone's life. And this is said most beautifully by this quote from the Talmud. He who saves one life, it's as if he saves an entire universe. This, by the way, you guys seen Schindler's List? Remember the ring they give him at the end when he saved 1,200 Jews' lives? That's the inscription more or less on the inside of the ring. The infinite value of every human life. By the way, keep in mind that the rabbis are saying this at the same time as the Romans are killing thousands of people for entertainment. It's a very revolutionary concept. Moving along to peace. What's the word for peace in Hebrew? Shalom. What's the word for hello in Hebrew? Shalom. Isn't it interesting? So basic is peace to the Jewish worldview. It's how we greet our fellow human beings. Do you know in the Hebrew Bible, in Tanakh, the word shalom appears 240 times? That's a lot of times. It's talked about by all the great Jewish thinkers throughout history. You guys know the Rambam, Maimonides? Okay, just a little background on this man. He was born in Cordoba in Spain over 850 years ago. He ended up spending the latter part of his life in what is today Cairo, basically. But he codified all of Jewish law and philosophy into a brilliant book called the Mishnah Torah, 14 volumes, which gives us huge insight into what Judaism says about everything. Look at Maimonides' definition of the ideal of peace that is the Messianic era. He says, the sages and prophets not long for the Messianic era in order to rule the world nor to subdue the nations, but to be free to pursue Torah and its wisdom. At that time there will be no hunger and no war, no jealousy and no strife. The entire world will be entirely occupied to acquire the knowledge of God, as it says. The world will be full of the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea. And by the way, the best proof of the Jewish obsession with peace doesn't come from Jewish sources. What's the world body today supposedly dedicated to bringing peace to the world when they're not condemning Israel? I'm sorry, I had to say that. Yeah, in Israel we call them the useless nations. By the way, the General Assembly is the most destructive body in the entire world today. You know there have been more resolutions passed against Israel than every other country in the world combined in the last 30 years. It's unbelievable. I have a whole presentation just on that topic, but let's not go there. But if you go to, in theory it's a nice idea. If you go outside General Assembly headquarters in Manhattan, I'm sure you've all been there. At one point, school trip was the last time I was there, I think, like 40 years ago. Outside is a wall with a quote from the prophet Isaiah, which is the motto of the UN about beating swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. Why is this quote, of all the quotes in human history, the motto of the UN? Because the founders of the United Nations know that the people who first introduced peace as the ideal permanent state for the human race are the Jewish people. Moving along to equal justice. What's the word for justice in Hebrew? Anyone know? Tzedek, very good. What's the word for charity in Hebrew? You all know that. Tzedakah. The root of charity is justice, even linguistically. It's a very powerful point there. The word tzedek appears 120 times in the Hebrew Bible. It's interesting. Shalom 240, tzedek 120. Exactly half. Maybe it's a connection. Maybe you need twice as much justice to get a little peace. Maybe that's why it says tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice you shall pursue. But out of the obsession with this word comes another concept which totally changes the way, especially the Western world, looks at the idea of equal justice. Right in Leviticus 19. And by the way, if you want to see where pretty much all the values that make up liberal democratic society come from, just go to Leviticus chapter 19. It is the greatest concentration of moral, ethical teachings in any book in all of human history, but it's right there. And it says, you shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. You shall not respect the person of the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty, but in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. In simple English, it means no favoritism, which today seems like, a no-brainer. We don't show favoritism. Everyone's equal before the law. The reason we don't appreciate this point is we live in societies that are essentially just, and we don't have people like these monarchs who are cutting our heads off and things like that. You know, today, you think of a monarch. Who do we all think of? A reigning monarch in the world today. We all think of the same person. Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of England. They just had a nice royal wedding. The British may have no empire left, but boy, did they know how to do a wedding. Except the Queen's dress. Oh, terrible. Never mind. She dressed better when she was with Obama the other day. But no, seriously, think of the Queen of England. This woman pays taxes, has really no political power, and gets zero nachas from her kids. Hopefully more from its grandchildren and great-grandchildren. This is not a monarchy. You look at these guys, a Jewish king, you see a tremendous contrast. You see, every Jew is supposed to write a Torah scroll. Today, most of us don't do that because we're not scribes, so we pay someone else to do it. But a Jewish king has a commandment to write one scroll, as every Jew is supposed to write, and a second scroll, because he's the king of Israel, a mini Torah scroll that he keeps like with some Velcro attached to his arm. Why does the king of Israel walk around with like a little Torah scroll attached to his arm? It says it right in Deuteronomy. And when the king sits on the throne of his kingdom, he will write a copy of the Torah, and it will be with him, and he'll read from it all the days of his life. So he will learn to fear the Lord his God and keep all the words of his Torah and do its statutes. The king has to know as the King of Kings, God, and no one, not even the king, is above the law. This, by the way, this quote, and not the Magna Carta, King John, 1215 England, this quote is the first example in human history of limiting the power of a monarch. And you guys should also appreciate, if you study your biblical law, that the Jewish governmental system was not a pure monarchy, nor was it a theocracy like in Iran where the mullahs run everything. It was a mixed system of checks and balance, separation of powers. Great point of trivia. The biblical government of Israel was used as the model by the founding fathers of the United States to create the U.S. government. They just took a king out and put a president in. But in biblical Israel, chief political leader is the king. Who's the chief religious leader? The high priest, not the king. That's a huge innovation. That is separation of church and state. That the Pharaoh is not a living God. It's a separate job for them. Okay, there's a high priest, the Kohen Gadol. And where did the judicial legislative power rest in biblical Israel? In which body? Anyone know? The Sanhedrin. The Skenim in Hebrew. The 71 elders, this was the Jewish Supreme Court. This was like the Congress and the Supreme Court. They adjudicated and legislated. Incredible power the Sanhedrin had. Now, anywhere else in the world to have that power, it was the golden rule thing, birth and wealth. What did you have to sit in the Sanhedrin? Anyone know? Sit on the Sanhedrin, there's certain qualifications. Any idea what they were? Sorry? Money was preferable because it was hard to bribe you, like Bloomberg mayor, you know. That was a good one, but there are even more basic ones than that. Sorry? Knowledge of Torah, but more basic than that, you had to be married with kids. Do you know that? You know that? Now all the parents go, of course. Come on, it's the great. Why? Because the Sanhedrin, as a Supreme Court, could pass a death sentence. Every human being is someone's child. Being a parent teaches you mercy. Right? The fact that our parents allowed us to live through being teenagers is definitely a sign they learn mercy. Like Roseanne Barr once said, now that I have teenagers, I realize why some mammals eat their young. No, seriously. But after you get past married with kids, you had to have encyclopedic knowledge of all law, everything, especially Jewish law. No computer, no Google, no Wikipedia. Everything in the brain, and unquestioning integrity. Like straight as an arrow. Come on today. Political integrity, it's like an oxymoron. You know, like jumbo shrimp, military intelligence, words that don't go together. French military victories. My English wife says, American culture. I say British cooking. They don't get dinner for like a month. Anyway, it's a very unique system. It's a meritocracy. The best person for the job got the job regardless of their position in society. Okay, moving on to education. Now this, by the way, is very interesting because this is one of the areas where Judaism is truly unique in human history. Because and by the way, we could actually skip this point because most Jewish parents actually think that there are 11 big commandments. I know the big 10. We have them up here somewhere? No, they're there, right there. What's number 11? Thou shalt go to college. We Jews are educationally obsessed people. You know, in Tractate Higher Education of the Talmud, it's fictitious. It says preferably Ivy League with full scholarship up to PhD. That's called glorifying the commandments. Remember that joke about, you know, the theological debate about when is the fetus viable, when can it live outside the womb, and the Jewish mother's answer, when it graduates from medical or law school? Now, Jews are educationally obsessed people throughout history. Today, what percentage of America is Jewish? 1.7%. Yet Jews make up on average 10% of the student body and faculty of pretty much every college and university. In the Ivy League schools, you know, Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Princeton, Cornell, 20 to 25% of the student body and faculty is Jewish. Harvard Law School today, tenured professors from Dershowitz on down is 40% Jewish. But it has nothing to do with Jews in the modern world. It has everything to do with a unique status that almost no one knows. Jews are history's only literate nation, period. In the ancient world I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the only nation that liked wisdom. Many nations valued wisdom. The Greeks loved wisdom. The Chinese thought wisdom was great. But when their rates of literacy amongst the masses were down at less than 1%, the Jewish rates of literacy were way up there. By the way, the lowest rate of literacy, I think, in Jewish history was not thousands of years ago. According to my checking out, it's an estimate, but I think it was about 150 to 200 years ago. The Jews coming from Poland, like our great-grandparents or grandparents, some of us, was probably the poorest educated group of Jews ever in human history, in Jewish history, and their rate of literacy was 70%, which was the highest rate of literacy of any immigrant population in America in 1900, and 10 percentage points higher than the American literacy rate at the time. And that's probably the worst educated Jews in history were those people. And it goes back to the very different idea that we have about education. Look at what Maimonides says about education over 800 years ago. Appoint teachers for the children in every country, province, and city. In any city that does not have a school, excommunicate the people of the city until they get teachers for the children. If they don't, destroy the city, because the world exists only because of the breath of children studying. You see how strongly this is stated? Destroy the city? Trust me, guys, no Jewish community was ever destroyed because it didn't have a school, because the Jewish people literally had free public education way before anyone ever thought of it. And if you're thinking, yeah, come on, Maimonides, Rabbi, it's Jewish propaganda. Look at what medieval French Catholic monk and theologian Peter Abelard says about the Jews 800 years ago. A Jew, however poor, if he had 10 sons, would put them all to letters, which means educate them. Not for gain as the Christians do, but for understanding of God's law. And not only his sons, but his daughters. Family. Now, family for Jews is huge. You know why? It's the number one excuse to get together and eat. which we all know is the #1 Jewish pastime. I'm sure all of you have heard that joke by now. A summary of all Jewish holidays. They tried to kill us. We won. Let's eat. It works for like every holiday. But seriously, if you go back to the first male-female relationship in the Bible, Adam and Eve, it says right there in Genesis, a man shall leave his mother and father and cling to his wife, and they will become one flesh. Now, this is not talking about giving your wife a hug. As nice as that is, the Torah is bringing down a beautiful Kabbalistic metaphysical idea that's called zivug, that a man and a woman are two halves of the same soul. They come together to create one being, and that you are not complete until you are married, and specifically, that the sexual and emotional energy of a man is supposed to be focused exclusively into a legally binding relationship with a woman called marriage, and should not be directed elsewhere. Judaism came along and taught the world, guys, keep your hands off of little boys and animals and prostitutes. Judaism is not anti-sexual, by the way. Not like the Roman Catholic Church thing here, okay? In Jewish law, by the way, it's a legal obligation for a husband to physically satisfy his wife. Not to do so is grounds for divorce. And sorry, guys, it doesn't go the other way. But it's not just a notion of creating a relationship based on controlling and directing, but rather on loving and respecting your spouse, as Maimonides said beautifully. And so our rabbis decreed that a man should honor his wife more than himself and love her as much as he loves himself. This is very short, but incredibly progressive and powerful. Transformative. And way ahead of our Greek friend Palladius, who said, marriage brings a man only 2 happy days. The day he takes his bride to bed and the day he lays her in her grave. Few people appreciate how much Judaism controlling and directing sexuality was a tremendous stabilizing force in human history. You guys know Dennis Prager? He's a big talk radio guy and an author. He summed it up beautifully when he said, man's nature, undisciplined by values, will allow sex to dominate his life and the life of society. When Judaism demanded that sexual activity be channeled into marriage, it changed the world. Societies that did not place boundaries around sexuality were stymied in their development. The subsequent dominance of the Western world can, to a significant extent, be attributed to the sexual revolution initiated by Judaism and later carried forward by Christianity. And last but not least, social responsibility. And this, by the way, brings us to the other area where Judaism and the Jewish people are unique in human history. Not only are we the only literate nation in the ancient world, the Jewish people are the only nation to always have social welfare infrastructure. The smallest, poorest Jewish communities had social welfare infrastructure far more comprehensive and far older than anything the greatest empires had. Think about, 200 years ago in the ghetto in Rome, 5,000 Jews supported 36 charities. The statistics for tzedakah societies in Eastern Europe of 200 years ago when everyone was poor are absolutely unbelievable. And it goes back to one of the most basic ideas the Jewish people taught the world. Two quotes in Leviticus. First one is this one, Lo talmod adam re'echa. Don't stand by your neighbor's blood. What does that mean? If you see someone bleeding, don't stand in it because you ruin your shoes? It means if you see a human being in distress, physical, emotional, or economic, you have an obligation to help. There's a lot of Jewish lawyers in this world, but we didn't invent law. Law is the natural outgrowth of any society that doesn't want anarchy. And all legal codes are remarkably similar. Don't murder, don't steal, stop at the red light, pay your taxes, you're a good citizen. Judaism contains those aspects, but has a unique proactive component. Actively do good. Think about it. Today in the world, if you see someone in distress and you don't help, what are you? It's not my problem. I'm a bystander. I don't want to be involved in this. Judaism says a human being makes basically one of two decisions. You're part of the problem or you're part of the solution. Doing nothing makes you part of the problem, and you have a legal obligation to be part of the solution. Do you know it's like almost 3,400 years since the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, and there is virtually no legal code in the world outside of Jewish legal code that demands that you actively do good. And that's most beautifully stated by the second quote, which is probably the three most famous words in the entire Hebrew Bible, Ve'ahavta le'arecha kamocha. Love your neighbor as yourself. Like, what does that mean? In Jewish law, it means you have an obligation to give 10% of your income, whether you like it or not. You have to help the widows, the orphans, the downtrodden, the oppressed. It's not just Jews, it's also non-Jews. It's not just human beings. Do you guys appreciate that the first environmental law and the first animal rights legislation that appears anywhere in the world appears in the Hebrew Bible? It's a whole vision spanning all civilization. Take responsibility for the world. It's been part and parcel of Jewish infrastructure and community life everywhere at all times and way before anyone else thought of it. And you should also appreciate that many of the great social thinkers and legal thinkers, this is the hottest topic in political science today. It's so new I got to add it in here. That the influence of Jewish law, not just nice quotes from the Bible, on early modern thinking and the foundations of liberal democracy is absolutely unbelievable. This is stuff that's coming out all over the place. It's been suppressed, literally. probably out of anti-Semitism and anti-religious sentiment. But it's an unbelievable topic. But it's been part and parcel of Jewish communal life and infrastructure everywhere in all times. And it's amazing how many non-Jewish thinkers, intellectuals, social thinkers, philosophers have taken the ideas from the Bible and used them to create not just government, but the concept of modern social welfare and thinking about that idea. Here's a great example. Lyman Abbott, he's an American Christian preacher and publicist who wrote in the beginning of the 20th century. He says, it would be impossible to mention any other people of even a much later age whose law and constitution embodied ideals so noble as that embodied in Hebrew civil laws, or any people whose history shows the existence of political institutions so essentially just, free, and humane. We Gentiles owe our life to Israel. It is Israel who, in bringing us the divine law, has laid the foundation of liberty. It is Israel who had the first free institutions the world ever saw. When sometimes our own unchristian prejudices flame out against the Jewish people, let us remember that all that we have and all that we are, we owe under God to what Judaism has given us. And that's a nice quote. So what are we left with, guys? This amazing fact that the teeny tiny Jewish people have had this monumental impact on the values and vision of all of human culture. This huge impact. But we're left with one final question before we finish. Because we understand the Jews have had this big impact. The question is why? What is it about us that enabled us to do this? So to understand that point, we have to look at one more point, one more idea. But it's the idea from which we get all of this and without which we have none of this. So the question is, besides obvious great Jewish contributions to civilization like guilt, bagels, junk bonds, leverage buyouts, Einstein, Marx, Freud, 25% of all Nobel Prizes since 1900, and 25% of the Forbes 400 list of the wealthiest people in the world, what is the most important idea that we gave the world? Sorry? Monotheism. One God, brought to you by the Jewish people. One God changes everything. One God and one standard of morality that comes from that God. Dennis Prager likes to call it ethical monotheism. This is an idea which in hindsight we see has totally transformed the world. In hindsight, today we don't appreciate how much it has, but we jump back in time for just one more minute. Go back 4,000 years ago. Here's Joe Average, ancient guy, contemplating his spiritual and moral universe thousands of years ago. Guys, in the ancient world, there's no such thing as secular. No one's secular. Everyone's religious, but all religions are polytheistic. What's polytheism? Multiple gods. Remember, every force in nature had a god that governed it. Zeus is the god of heaven. Poseidon is the god of the sea, you know. And these gods were just like you and I, except for two things. They existed in the world with us. They ate, they slept around, but they were superhuman and immortal. They manipulated you. You could try and impact them. But one thing was clear. By the way, all ancient societies had value systems and laws, not the issue. But there was no absolute standard of values because every culture had different standards. You perceived different gods wanted different things from you. Guys, the ancient world was essentially amoral. What's amoral? Amoral, without values in an absolute sense. And because it was amoral, it degenerated into being immoral, which explains the tremendous contrast between all the beauty and creativity of the ancient world and all the callousness and horrible things they were doing. Because it all came out of a world where no one could say this is right and this is wrong in an absolute sense. You know who said it best? Dostoevsky. You know that great Russian writer? It's a great quote. Where there is no God, everything is permissible. Into this world almost 4,000 years ago, out of Ur-Kasdim came one man, Abraham. Where's Ur-Kasdim today? We all know where it is. I'll give you a hint. There's like hundreds of thousands of U.S. soldiers there, and it's not Afghanistan. Iraq. You know, Ambrose Bierce, who was a writer during the American Civil War, he has a great quote. He said, "War is God's way of teaching Americans geography." It's true. Anyway, out of Iraq, almost 4,000 years ago, it's interesting, really cool. According to the Jewish calendar, Abraham was born in 1948 of our calendar. Cool, right? State of Israel, 1948. Okay. Out of Iraq almost 4,000 years ago comes one man. Abraham was great for two reasons. A, in a world that has totally lost connection with the idea of one God, Abraham is a free-thinking super genius. He's able to think outside the box and come to the realization there's one infinite being God and one standard of morality. But can you imagine being the only person in the world to believe in an idea that no one else could comprehend or accept? Few of us have the chutzpah to whisper to our best friends. And that's the real greatness of Abraham. He says, I want truth regardless of consequences. He's a real intellectual, a true idealist. He says, I choose to live and if necessary to die for the reality of God. Now we Jews know you don't live for God, you don't die for God. He's infinite. You can't do anything for infinity. But Abraham recognizes without relationship with God, we're doomed. We're going to eat each other alive. That's what Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad is. That's our mantra, our Jewish battle cry. God is it, the source of values, spirituality, morality. This idea has been so transformative. Just to give you a teeny taste of it, if we go back to the beginning of the Bible, it says in Genesis, we're created b'tselem Elokim, in His image. God has no parts. So what do we have that's godlike? A soul, a neshama, very good. A divine spark, a piece of the infinite. Look at the moral implications of just this one concept. If every human being has this infinite spark within him or her, every life has infinite value, which is why the rabbis say saving a life is like saving a universe. And how about equal justice? If every human being has a soul, there is a fundamental equality amongst all of us, which is why the prophet Amos says in the Bible, has not one God made us all? Are we not all His children? And if you're made in God's image, social responsibility. You have an obligation to act like God. One of the 613 commandments, mitzvot, is v'halachta b'drachav. Be like God. Go in His ways. Like, what does that mean? Like I sit in a cloud with a big sound system throwing lightning bolts at people? No. The rabbis say, just as He is kind and merciful, so too do you as a human being have to emulate God and be kind and merciful. We don't appreciate, trust me, we don't appreciate how impactful these ideas are, but I want to show you one final quote of one person who definitely does. Here's John Adams, second president of the United States. It's a wonderful quote. He says, I will insist the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. If I were an atheist and believed in blind eternal fate, I should still believe that fate had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations. If I were an atheist of another sect, I should still believe that chance had ordered the Jews to preserve and propagate for all mankind the doctrine of a supreme, intelligent, wise, almighty sovereign of the universe, which I believe to be the great essential principle of all morality and consequently of all civilization. They are the most glorious nation that ever inhabited this earth. The Romans and their empire were but a bubble. They were nothing in comparison to the Jews. They have given religion to 3/4 of the globe and have influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other nation, ancient or modern. And if you were running for president today, I would definitely vote for him. And again, it's not just him saying it. There's so many examples. But this brings us, guys, to what our mission has been in the world. It's not to conquer the world. It's not to convert the world. It's to be a model for the world. To create a nation based on certain values that come from relationship with God. That's a light to the rest of the world. Which brings us, by the way, to the most misunderstood concept that everyone, if you don't remember anything of what I say tonight, you got to at least remember this point. This chosen people thing. How do we explain it? So the traditional understanding is, what's chosen? We explain it like this. Abraham says to God, so to speak, God, I choose you. I choose to dedicate my life to teaching the world about relationship with you and the values that come from that relationship. And God, so to speak, says back to Abraham, you're choosing me, Abraham? Then I choose you back. You and your descendants, us, the Jewish people. What are we chosen for? It's not privilege. It might be a big privilege to be Jewish, but we're not chosen for privilege. We're chosen for responsibility. What's the responsibility? In Hebrew, the term we always use is tikkun olam. How do we translate that? Fix the world. Like, how's that for a cause? A little bigger than save the whales? The ultimate cause of being the nation whose job it is to teach humanity about morality, spirituality, to elevate the world through being an example to the highest moral, spiritual level humanly possible. Which brings us to the last little part of the riddle. We understand how the Jews have been a monumental civilizing force in human history. We understand that it all comes from the concept of one God without which you got none of it. But what's the historical process? Now, this is the thing I'm going to do literally in a minute. But when I wrote the book, which you can get at the end if you want to read it, because the book always got more stuff in it, half the book is explaining the amazing historical process whereby we, the teeny tiny Jewish people who everyone hates, managed to get the entire world to buy into our vision. It's the ultimate subliminal marketing victory. But you guys got to appreciate, from the birth of Abraham to the birth of Christianity, 2,000 years, we exist alone in the world as the only people believing in one God, and everyone thinks we're crazy and is trying to kill us. That's what Hanukkah was about. Most of us learn Hanukkah was about freedom from Greek occupation. Sorry, that's not what it's about. The Greeks had occupied Israel for a century and a half by the time Hanukkah came around. But when the Greeks went after Judaism, it was history's first religious ideological war. Paganism trying to destroy the only monotheistic faith. And after being told we are crazy and trying to kill us for 2,000 years, out of Judaism will come two offshoot faiths, Christianity and Islam, which will ultimately convert billions of people whose ancestors used to be a bunch of amoral polytheists into a worldview that's essentially Jewish. I mean, think about it. Any believing Christian or Muslim will tell you, there's one God. Okay, the Christian one's got a few parts. We'll put that on hold. He created the world. He gave one standard of morality to the world. He gave the Jewish people the Torah at Mount Sinai. And then he changed his mind and chose us instead. That's a different problem, a separate presentation. But that is the greatest spiritual transformation in all of human history. And what's the other way that Jewish ideas have gotten out to the world and gotten to places that might not be Christian or Muslim? It's not through a political, it's not through let the cat out of the bag. It's not through a religious system, it's through a political ideology. What am I talking about? What's the fastest growing form of government in the last 200 years? Modern democracy, not the ancient Greek version. Overwhelmingly, that comes from Jewish values. And that's the topic I mentioned before that is just coming out now, huge, how much more the Bible and Jewish law influenced modern political thinking than we ever thought before, was ever taught before. But the whole notion of, God being the source of rights and responsibilities, it's right there enshrined in the Declaration of Independence of the United States. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that amongst these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So to put this all together, guys, and come to a close, if you make a graph of religions of the world, that we're not really a religion. We're a people and a religion together. We're an ethno-religion. But no matter what you call us, we are so small, we don't even appear on the graph here. Magnifying glass. Okay. 0.25% of the world's population. It's actually an error there. It should be 0.25, not 0.25. We're not that small. We don't even appear on the graph. We're so teeny. But if you make a graph of impact on the world, we're right off the top of the scale, guys. Smallest of nations, biggest of impacts. Why did I create this presentation? So many Jews, especially younger Jews, are walking around thinking Judaism is meaningless and irrelevant. Nothing could be further from the truth. We got to have some Jewish pride. Now, pride is a dangerous word. It doesn't mean walking around and saying, I'm better than you and I'm better than you. But it does mean just having justifiable self-respect at the historically proven power of Jewish people and Jewish ideas to change the world. Because it is a fact that the entire human race is in a completely different place because of Judaism and the Jewish people. And as much as the world, like we saw at the very beginning, has moved much closer to this vision of values, and now they all want it, okay, and as much as we've gotten pretty close, we're not quite done yet. We can't quite turn to each other and say, great job, almost 4,000 years struggling against the world. Let's retire to Miami or better yet, Jerusalem. We've got a little more work to do, and I just want to close with a little food for thought about what each and every one of us in our own unique way should be doing to make this vision that the whole world wants a reality so we can get to the end of the story. So first point to close is that Judaism teaches that every human being, like a snowflake, is unique. There's something only you can do that no one else can do. Okay, our job in this world is to bring out our own unique potential. Be the best me I can possibly be. Now think about it. You buy a complicated piece of equipment like a computer or a car, it comes with a big manual. I hate manuals. I use to prop my monitor up with. The most complicated thing in the universe is probably a human being, and Judaism traditionally teaches that we have our own guidebook. It comes from our manufacturer in heaven, God. It's called the Torah. The literal definition of Torah is instructions. Torah Chaim, the guidebook for living. It's the guidebook to how to bring out your own unique potential. Because you can't represent the Jewish people until you know what the Jewish people represents, guys. Ignorance and not anti-Semitism is the greatest thing that always threatens us. And when we learn to bring out our own unique potential and become literate Jewishly, we will soon learn that our job in this world is to be a light. Jews volunteer for causes more than any other people on the planet Earth. The way I usually say it is Jews for every ism except Judaism. Now, I have nothing against most of the causes in the world, but if you think about it, causes are just dealing with symptoms of deeper problems. Our job really is, individually and collectively, to change the values in the world. Because it's only by changing humanity's values that we truly make the world a different and better place. We have to be a light. And the job of being a light is not just for a couple of rabbis and educational institutions and outreach programs. It's the collective responsibility of all the Jewish people. Like that little Israeli folk song goes, Kol echad or katan, ubi yachad or etan. Each of us is one small light, but together we shine bright. Each and every one has an obligation, guys, to be educated, proud Jews, proactive Jews, work on Jewish unity. This is my big point today. Why are we fighting amongst each other so much? There's so many people out there trying to get us. We got to focus on what unites us and not what divides us. But we have to be educated, proud, and focus the amazing potential on finishing that job. Now, I know it sounds like the impossible dream. Look at the Jewish world. Look at how many challenges we have with assimilation and anti-Semitism and ignorance and infighting. But guys, trust me, as someone who studies and teaches a lot of history, our very survival, the fact that you're sitting in this room is supernatural. What's impossible for other people is possible for us. We just have to will it and work on it. You know who said it best? First Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, who was not a religious man, by the way, but he appreciated the uniqueness of Jewish history and the power of the Jewish people. He said it best: a Jew who doesn't believe in miracles is not a realist. An amazing quote for a man having a very bad hair day. Guys, when we finally come together, educated Jews, proud Jews, committed Jews, unified Jews, will finally be able to give the world, please God, the vision of the prophet Isaiah, which all of humanity, and not just the Jewish people, has been waiting for. And the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills. And all the nations shall flow into it. Many people shall go and say, come, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. And he will teach us of his ways, and will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth Torah, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And thank you very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.